Every day, we're confronted with an overwhelming volume of information. Breaking news alerts, viral videos, posts shared by friends, influencers, politicians, and strangers. We scroll through competing claims about elections, public health, natural disasters, global conflicts, and increasingly content generated by artificial intelligence. At the same time, trust in institutions, journalism, governments, and even one another continues to erode. Many of us feel caught up between two realities, one where misinformation seems to be everywhere, and another where it's becoming harder to agree on what is considered reliable information in the first place. Misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories, the list goes on. But one thing that we fail to confront is that the dissemination of information, that notion of speculation, trying to find answers, making sense of the unknown, these are all incredibly human behaviors. When we encounter uncertainty, whether it's a natural disaster, a public health crisis, or a major political event, we instinctively try to make sense of what is happening. We look for answers, we share links, we fill in gaps, we talk, we see what others are sharing, and we tell stories. So then, what happens when our collective sensemaking is mediated by platforms designed to reward speed, outrage, and attention? Yes, clickbait content. What happens when influencers become the new interpreters of reality, when algorithms shape our political instincts, and when AI makes it increasingly difficult to know whether the image or video in front of us is actually real? And perhaps most importantly, can a democratic society survive if people no longer believe they know what is happening? Welcome back to Art of Citizenry podcast, where we unpack the systemic power structures that have shaped culture, politics, and policy. I'm your host, Manpreet Kaur Kalra. Today's guest has spent more than a decade studying rumors and the systems surrounding them. I'm joined by Dr. Kate Starbird, professor at the University of Washington and co-founder of the UW Center for an Informed Public. Her work currently focuses on the spread of online rumors during crises, elections, and breaking news events.
I am a professor at the University of Washington. I'm actually in a department called Human-Centered Design and Engineering. And I've been doing research on online rumors, misinformation, disinformation, and increasingly propaganda since 2013. I actually started as a researcher of what we call crisis informatics. We were just looking at how social media tools and other digital platforms are used during crisis events, natural disasters, emergencies, other kinds of things. And over time, we began to see that sort of rumors and misinformation were a bigger and bigger part of what we were looking at. Initially, we were kind of just looking at how people were making sense of these events that are uncertain and confusing and anxiety-provoking in real time using these new platforms. And over time, about 2015, 2016, we began to realize we weren't just looking at accidental rumors and misinformation, but sort of pervasive disinformation that was sinking into the fabric of the internet, into the algorithms, into the networks of friend and following relationships.
You were among the first to use large-scale social media data to study how misinformation spreads. What did that landscape look like when you first started doing this work, and how has that evolved?
Oh, this is a huge question. It's going to be hard to answer in a few minutes. But I mean, when I first started studying Twitter, it was actually 2009, 2010, we were looking at the Haiti earthquake, and Twitter was small at that time. But they also had open APIs, and they would for about 12 more years. And that meant that as a researcher, we could just pull all the data that was being shared publicly, not in private accounts or DMs, but all the public data. We could pull that into our servers on campus, and we could analyze that in a lot of different ways. We created different kinds of visualizations. We've developed this really fascinating method of using both sort of quantitative and computational methods to kind of look at patterns at scale, and then using real qualitative effort to go and read tweets, look at accounts, really kind of like go back and forth between what I would say 10,000 feet and then tweet by tweet. That let us really kind of see a richness of what was happening and also get a sense of both like what the broader patterns were and then also these weird little niche things that were happening. Now, over time, the behavior is, vastly larger. It's multi-platform now. There's a lot of things happening in different places. Instead of being mostly real time and sort of chronologically ordered, it's algorithmically sorted. And so that sort of changes even how we infer what things mean. And increasingly, we're not able to collect data like that anymore. Elon Musk shut down the ability for researchers to gather data like that. Other platforms have followed suit, Reddit and others, where we used to have access to a lot of data. And at the same time, the behaviors have changed. What used to be sort of this network distributed kind of activity where different actors were kind of playing different roles has increasingly become influencer centric, where there's sort of like communities around the influencers that kind of interact with that influencer, but that influencer does a lot of channeling and sort of leading these community efforts to make sense of what's going on. And so the behaviors are changed drastically. The structure has changed, and our ability to understand what's going on as researchers is increasingly diminished in terms of the data. We're having to become more creative in terms of the methods.
What you're describing reminds me of the exact same tools digital marketers use to understand customer behavior, tracking patterns, mapping networks, identify what people respond to, and how ideas move. But in your work, those tools are being used to study something much more consequential, how information, and in this case, rumors, spread through society. The UW Center for an Informed Public studies how information moves through society, especially during moments of crisis, uncertainty, and political tension. The center's work is not necessarily about stopping every rumor from spreading, but rather helping people understand why rumors spread, how they mislead, and what decisions they might influence, especially for people like election workers, political officials, lawyers, and judges who may be asked to respond to these claims in real time. Your focus on rumors, particularly surrounding elections and political tensions, has led some Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives to call you as part of the, quote, censorship industrial complex.
I think we launched in December of 2019, and I don't know if you remember what happened after that, but pretty soon we were studying rumors about COVID, which turned out to be sort of a perfect storm for uncertainty and the kinds of things that drive the spread of rumors and misinformation. And then we studied the 2020 election, and we were sort of analyzing and communicating about rumors and falsehoods about the election in real time, and that made us a lot of friends. Especially among the people that wanted to sort of deny the results of the election and eventually the people that tried to memory hole the events of January 6th. And that's where we came to be known by the moniker, the sort of censorship industrial complex, which is a term that, if that's a true thing, then so was the bullshit industrial complex, which is what we were studying. And that is far more lucrative and far more sort of connected to the sinews of power around the world.
Yeah, I was especially drawn to your research because I remember as a mass media student around 2009, we were starting to see the role social media could play in social movements or movement building. At the time, platforms like Twitter, or rather now X, were being discussed as tools for mobilization, especially in the context of the Arab Spring. There was this sense that social media could help people organize, challenge power, and build movements in real time. And of course, that is still part of the story, but the information landscape has really shifted dramatically. The same tools that once seemed to promise democratic participation are now also being used to spread misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, and conspiracy theories. And now with AI-generated content, all of that can be produced and circulated at even greater scale. In some ways, rumors can start to function like movements of their own, I guess. They build communities, create shared narratives, and give people a sense of belonging around a very particular version of reality. So before we go further, I want to pause on language. These terms get tossed around a lot, misinformation and disinformation, but they're not always clearly defined. So what do these terms actually mean?
Yeah, I mean, the vocabulary in the space is like changing, it's dynamic, it's contested. And so sometimes even hard to, even as a researcher in this space, to grasp onto a definition and then be able to say, this is how it's defined and this is how everyone defines it. I have my own students come into like oral general exams where they have to defend their own ideas, and they will have a different definition of these terms than I do as their advisor. And that's okay. I mean, that's part of like, we're making sense of concepts that are actually evolving in real time. Conceptually, we'll start out with misinformation. It's almost like a kind of umbrella term for just falsehoods, not necessarily intentional, but things that are untrue. And this can be used in a couple of different ways, but often you'll see it just sort of used as an umbrella term for a certain kind of content, as well as for the field that coalesced around the study of misinformation for a while, just to be able to include a lot of different things under one term. We also see the word disinformation, and disinformation is a little bit more complicated at a very sort of superficial level. Disinformation is information that's sort of intentionally false or misleading for some kind of purpose, right? So for political gain or financial gain or gather more followers, whatever it is. So disinformation has this idea of intentionality.
So would disinformation then be like a piece of content or a story, or is it more complicated than that?
It's hard to assign disinformation to a single piece of content. It's more sort of a campaign, a series of things that kind of work together to mislead. And one of the really kind of interesting things about disinformation is at its core, there's usually some kind of truth or plausibility, and then it's sort of like layered with exaggerations and falsehoods to create this sort of false sense of reality or false sense of what's going on.
What about conspiracy theories? Where do those fit?
We know it's sort of this patterned way of thinking about things where people tend to see events in the world as being sort of purposeful and an outcome of some sort of secret forces that are working together in some kind of conspiracy. One of the complicating factors is sometimes conspiracy theories turn out to be true. Most of the time they don't, but occasionally they are true. So it's like the language around conspiracy and conspiracy theory can be complicated. But the term we've kind of increasingly started to use, and actually the term we started with years ago, was rumor. And rumor is a term that allows us to work in real time when we don't yet know whether or not something's true, and we don't really know the intentionality. So rumors are just informal stories about what's happening that are spreading. And they often turn out to be false, but they can turn out to be true. They're sort of a natural part of the way that we make sense of events as human beings. You know, the way that we make sense of uncertainty and things that are happening in the world. They're very common during crisis events, which is why, as a researcher of crisis informatics, that's why my team ended up studying misinformation and disinformation eventually, is because those events are often characterized by rumors. It's just how we as people make sense of things. And so in some ways, rumors aren't necessarily wrong either. They're not necessarily harmful or bad. They can be harmful if they turn out to be untrue and cause people to make decisions that are harmful to themselves, but they're not inherently bad. They're just part of how we make sense of the world.
Okay, so a rumor can be true, false, or somewhere in between. In my understanding, it's effectively a narrative that is circulating while people are still trying to make sense of what is happening when there is uncertainty. But with disinformation, there seems to be a question of intent, like someone is deliberately spreading something false or misleading with a purpose. Misinformation, on the other hand, suggests that people may be sharing something false without realizing it. And yet, in practice, those categories really seem to blur. You might have one group intentionally spreading disinformation, while many of the people who pick it up and spread it in their networks are simply just misinformed and may genuinely believe what they're sharing as fact or true. So how do you grapple with that blurring of lines in your research? How do you study something where intent, belief, and amplification are all so tangled together?
This is where when I have the oral general exams with my students and we have a conversation about where does misinformation end and disinformation start and vice versa. And in some ways it doesn't matter, right? Instead of looking at a piece of content, you look at kind of the larger thing that's happening. So especially when you think about disinformation, is it usually functions as part of a campaign. There's more than one sort of information action. There's sort of layers of deception that are happening. And in that case, when we study disinformation, in some cases where we can clearly say this is a disinformation campaign, we know it's happening, even in those cases, the majority of people that spread that content online are not intentionally spreading misinformation or falsehoods. The majority of people are sincere believers. We tend to think of them as unwitting agents. I often say they're unwitting but willing, right? So they're people that want to believe it. In some cases, they don't bother to double check it. It doesn't matter. In some cases, it doesn't even matter the truth value, although in other cases, they become very firm believers. And they're still sort of like passing that content along. I've seen people all over the political spectrum, including I bet all of us, if we look through all of our social media back through 2015 and 2014, before we became wiser for it, if we're old enough to have been online at that time, we've all been unwitting but willing spreaders of disinformation. It's just part of what it means to be online at this point.
Yeah, it almost feels like confirmation bias becomes part of the machinery here. When something affirms what I already believe, I may be less likely to question it. There is almost this instinctive reaction of course, that must be true. And then I share it because likely the people in my network have similar worldviews. And that starts to really create these information silos, or at least reinforce them, regardless of where someone falls on the political spectrum. I was recently talking with someone about what shows up in her Instagram feed, and it was striking how different it was from what I see in mine. It felt like we were almost looking at two entirely different versions of the internet, two different maps of what is urgent, what's popular, what people are angry about, and what conversations supposedly matter the most. And I think that is part of what makes this moment so disorienting. We are all online, but we are not necessarily inhabiting the same information environment. I do want to come back to that actually in just a bit, especially that role on platforms and algorithms and what role they play in shaping those silos. But before we get there, let's talk a bit about collective sense making, or how we come together to make sense of the world. What does that mean in this context? And why do rumors become especially powerful during moments of uncertainty?
So this idea of collective sense making is in times of uncertainty, when there's a disruption to the normal social routines or when things have changed. So crisis event is an example of this, but there are others as well. During those times of uncertainty, we as humans tend to come together to try to resolve that uncertainty. We don't like uncertainty. We don't like to live in it. And so we want to resolve it. And we come together, and the research has long kind of said that rumors are just a byproduct of this natural collective sense-making process that people take when disruptive things happen. And rumors, from that extent, they serve these sort of emotional, informational, psychological purposes. But we're also seeing how collective sense-making can sort of be intentionally disrupted or manipulated. And so disinformation can kind of be thought about as something that's just trying to disrupt the collective sense-making process, to make it harder for you to get to some sort of like collective truth, or to shape that outcome of what you think reality is based on somebody's objectives. And then conspiracy theories from that same perspective just kind of look like people begin to apply sort of the same frame over and over again of like, oh, it's a secret, secret conspiracy, secretive forces or puppet masters for what's going on. They apply that same frame over and over again. And instead of sort of starting from an open place of sense making, they start with like what they think the outcome is, and they try to assemble evidence to fit their theory, as opposed to taking the evidence and trying to find what the right interpretation is. And so this idea of collective sense making allows us to conceive of these same kind of terms that we already went over in the vocabulary from a slightly different perspective. And it's not perfect. It doesn't help us all the time, doesn't cover everything. But for us, we found it really valuable, especially for understanding sort of online activity where people are trying to make sense of a crisis event or breaking news event or something that has uncertainty and causes anxiety.
Is there a recent rumor, crisis, or information event that you and your team have been thinking about or tracking that helps illustrate how collective sense-making works in real time?
We can go for the White House Correspondents' Dinner. And the person that tried to get into that event with a weapon and ostensibly was allegedly trying to assassinate President Trump, and it seemed to be willing to kill other people as well. So it seemed to be a planned act of violence based on my collective sense making of what I've been able to see online, right? But when you get an event like that, so there are people that have already seen two assassination attempts in terms of like watch them kind of evolve online, and a whole group of people that are motivated to see those because they've been politically useful for President Trump, very scary for him, but afterwards they've been politically useful for him. I think there's been a sort of view on the left, well, if it's politically useful for him, it must not be true. And so they've begun to see these events through a lens of conspiracy. And so these conspiracy theories develop even as the first reports are coming through. People are saying, well, this can't be real, it has to be staged. And as a person who's done research in this space for a long time with crisis events, there are always people that are going to say that it's been staged, right? So it's certainly not surprising to see that kind of thing. It's just sort of the way a lot of people tend to see events nowadays. Part of reaction to just like so much information is coming at us that what's real begins to seem unreal. So some people are sort of politically motivated, not necessarily intentionally trying to spread a falsehood, but actually are seeing this event through this lens of conspiracy. And there may be other people that were motivated to try to, distort things for political purpose as well. And we'll also see events where the LA fires of more than a year ago now, but that was one where you see like the fires happen and then people try to score political points on them. They're trying to make it seem like it has to do with the local leadership. If that person's a Democrat, so the Republicans try to say it must be because of local leadership, or someone else on the left might try to say, okay, it's from climate change. And you see them kind of trying to highlight the parts of that event that fits their political perspective or helps them score political points. So a lot of what we see around the shaping of online sense making, and I can go back to like fires in 2012 that were happening in Colorado when I was there, you can see this like political point scoring as part of just like the online sense making process. And the people that became good at scoring those political points got more and more followers and became part of the sort of influencer infrastructure of these online spaces. And so that's sort of like, it's almost like it's gamed at this point. It's like people are like, oh, wait a minute, like an event just happened. I've got to get there with my political frames and start doing the framing wars and see who can win this one.
It sounds like rumors become kind of this storytelling tool. They allow people to take something uncertain or unresolved and fit it into a narrative that already makes sense to them. So then how do rumors begin? You've talked a bit about how often there's some grain of truth or plausibility at the center. But then what happens? How does it move from an observation into a larger narrative that people are starting to share, amplify, and really organize around?
I think there are different kind of journeys for rumors. There are conspiracy theories that like simmer at this tiny little level for a long time, and then something happens and then they take off. There are sort of like rumors with a nice photo during a crisis event that just sort of reflects something that people are worried about, which will instantly take off within 3 seconds of the person spreading them. There are, intentional clickbait kinds of things that look one way. And then there's sort of like these more sense-making rumors where people start out as sort of like honest people that are a little concerned, trying to figure out what's going on. And then they get sort of strategically amplified by people who want to use that rumor as part of either an effort to get attention or an effort to score political points. And so in the election space, it's more of that last type where you've got sort of usually just like an everyday person who's maybe a little suspicious of what's going on is, describing something that they saw at the polling station, or they've taken a picture of the ballot that arrived in their mailbox that doesn't seem right. So it starts with that and a little bit of speculation, and then maybe a little story builds around it in this kind of like smaller accounts. And then what'll happen is one of these influencer accounts will notice it and they will amplify it, and then it'll get amplified by a series of influencers and begin to spread much further and become part of the larger deep story or myth of voter fraud. And that's what we saw over and over again in 2020. Similarly, in 2024, though, the patterns were a little bit more established in the sense that like it didn't take as long for things to get to the top because people were already looking for it. And now there's like whole efforts to collate those kinds of rumors and amplify them quickly within certain kinds of communities. So, and again, the dynamics are changing a lot from 2020 when we're thinking about a very sort of networked virality, and more to 2026, we're looking at a more influencer-based, influencer communities, TikTok video, Nick Shirley kind of propaganda environment. And so I can't tell you exactly what the dynamics are going to look like in 2026, but this idea that they start with like an individual observation and then they get amplified through our sort of digital dynamics with political and financial motives is not all rumors, but many rumors in this environment.
Accountability feels especially complicated because platforms are not operating outside of politics. They're embedded into political systems. They're shaped by political narratives and increasingly used as tools of political power. Your team has tracked election rumors in real time. I'm curious, what patterns have you seen emerge across election cycles? Are there certain rumors or narratives that come back again and again?
Yeah, so our team has done US-based rumors around election administration. So not rumors around politics or policies, but rumors around when, where, how to vote, whether or not people will be safe at the polls, and then false claims that attempt to delegitimize election results and the kind of claims that led to January 6th that we may see again in 2026 if one party doesn't like the results. So we've studied those rumors since 2020. At this point, we've mapped out, I think we have like 250 different like tropes or like very common pieces that we see over and over again. 250 sounds like a lot, but it actually is pretty finite. At this point, we probably mapped 95% of the rumors that we'll see about election administration, election around voting or election results in 2026. There's some pretty basic ways that things mislead. We tend to think of a falsehood that it's like the facts are just wrong. But actually in the election space, that's not actually what happens. And it's usually not like something that's completely manufactured or something that's made up. There's usually something that seems off, that seems kind of confusing, or like the Sharpies bled through the ballots, or something that actually goes wrong, like the machine doesn't work right on election day. And what happens is people who don't really understand all of the layers of election security and how any issue would be actually, either caught or fixed or remedied later in the process can actually be pretty suspicious of what they see. So the rumors usually leverage that misinterpretation of something real rather than something that's completely false. They kind of like leverage a misinterpretation, and they sort of either exaggerate the impact of something that would be really small, like a small problem, or they obscure the remedies. Like they obscure how that would have been fixed somewhere along the process, because we have layers and layers of security. And then there's the final one is that they tend to see like accidents, and they'll say that it was on purpose, that it was an intentional effort, when really somebody made a mistake along the way, or, something gets misspelled on a ballot because someone made an error, and they'll kind of read that as some kind of conspiracy. And actually, if we take like 90% of the rumors, they follow one of those three ways of misleading. If people are just constantly suspicious of the processes, and they've been made to feel suspicious because there's a political movement that's trying to leverage that suspicion to suppress votes and deny results, then they begin to see every little thing in an election as evidence of some kind of fraud. And the challenge is we have like 3,600 different voting jurisdictions in the United States because we have a distributed system, and mistakes are going to happen somewhere. Like there's so many different processes, and it's complicated. And in fact, the laws are only getting more complicated. And so there's so much opportunity in this rich sort of tapestry of electing for rumors. And sure enough, they spread. And if people are motivated to spread them for political purpose, and we've got systems designed to do that, and whole networks of organizers that their whole thing is to amplify election rumors, it's going to consistently be part of our election process, at least for the next few cycles, until people get bored with it.
Throughout our conversation, I've been thinking about how much of the role of journalism and our shared understanding of reliable sources has changed. There was a time when many people looked at established news outlets as kind of a filter. In fact, journalism has long been understood as the, quote, fourth estate, not formally part of government, but essential to democracy because it helps hold power accountable and gives the public a shared basis for understanding what is happening. Of course, that system has never been perfect, but there was at least an expectation that information coming through established news outlets has gone through some process of verification before reaching the public. They have set standards. Now, the speed of information has completely changed that relationship. Social media rewards immediacy, and the influencer economy has trained people to think in terms of clout, likes, shares, comments, followers, reach, and increasingly, clout depends on being first, and being first is not the same as being right. That seems to create an especially volatile environment for rumors, one where the most sensational version of a story can travel faster than the most accurate one. There's kind of this loss of nuance, and the role that the fourth estate once played is increasingly displaced by platforms and personalities optimized for attention.
Yeah, I mean, rumors have always been part of how we make sense of crisis events and as humans, but obviously, the ways that our digital information ecosystems have evolved, the attention dynamics on these platforms in particular, have vastly changed the equation of the cost-benefit analysis of whether to spread something that's unverified. They reward more sensational content. Those conspiracy theories I was just talking about get rewarded in these online environments the way that like a straight news article does not. And then the timing of it is the traditional journalists, and we saw this, starting in 2010 when I was first starting to do the research. The traditional journalists could not keep up with the pace that the online convergers and eventually influencers could create content or share or amplify content. Like the reason the stuff that my team does became interesting is that these algorithms and these platforms and the way that they work, the logics of these platforms began to reconfigure how information flows. They began to reconfigure politics. They are reconfiguring values, in part because of the ways that they amplify certain kinds of content. And the way that that kind of content is not necessarily aligned with making shared sense of reality in a way that helps us solve actual problems, right? That just doesn't seem to be an outcome of these information spaces. And not to say that the information spaces before were perfect. They absolutely weren't. Certain people had much more power in terms of what their voices were and whether or not they were heard. And we had this idea that the internet was going to democratize voices. We would all have a voice. But what's happened is journalists have been displaced. They've been sort of, diminished in their capacity, but they've been replaced by these influencers, which don't have any commitment to the same kind of professional standards of reporting. And so it's a very dynamic, impactful, and challenging space we find ourselves in.
Influencers aren't just people with large follower accounts. An influencer can be a content creator who packages a story for an audience, or a news style account that aggregates and amplifies what is already getting attention, or even a podcaster or commentator who helps frame how a community understands an event. So influence is not only about scale, it is about function. Who is creating the content? Who is amplifying it? Who is curating the narrative? And who is becoming the person a community looks to as their lead sense maker? I think this matters because influencers are increasingly part of the infrastructure through which political movements grow. Rumors move through networks of influencers who package uncertainty into story, translate grievances into identity, and really help communities make sense of the world through a particular frame. That brings me to the question of rumor vulnerability. What actually makes people vulnerable to certain kinds of rumors? Is the algorithms and the platform design creating echo chambers, or are they amplifying existing social and political divisions?
I mean, they're intertwined, right? There's sort of our natural tendencies, our natural vulnerabilities, our biases, our tendency to want to believe things that align with what we already believe and reject things that don't align with our identity or something else. All of those are like part of why we've always been vulnerable to political propaganda and other kinds of things. And we always tend to share the rumor that's most salacious and sort of not pass along the information that's most mundane. So that's just part of who we are as people. But these environments are definitely, the digital information environments, the amplification, the algorithms, networks, all of those things, I firmly believe after watching this for 15 years, they're restructuring things. They're exaggerating or heightening problems and divisions. And they're also able to sort of target very specific kinds of groups in different ways. And yeah, I absolutely think that the design of these systems is playing a role in reconfiguring our information systems, our relationships, our politics, and our values. And I don't think we can disentangle it from very highly funded political campaigns that are part of that have figured out how to use this infrastructure to activate us, probably against our best interests, voting in ways that align with what the people who are willing and able to manipulate these platforms want us to be able to do. So I'm not going to say that in a huge conspiracy lens, but I just think that there are political actors that are very good at using the dynamics of these online platforms. And that's part of what we're seeing as well. So we can't disentangle like this political campaigning and a political sort of movement that's been laying the foundations to change politics and values for a long time. And then they were able to leverage the internet dynamics a lot better and very particularly on the right than they have been on the left. And I don't think we can disentangle that from the attentional dynamics and from our capacity and vulnerabilities as humans to, sort of grasp onto rumors and be vulnerable to disinformation during times of crises. And right now, so many things are a crisis. I think we're acutely vulnerable as people based on what's happening in the world. And that's intertwined with these other forces as well.
Over recent years, we've seen right-wing populist movements surge, not just in the US, but in Germany, for example, Latin America, Asia. India is a great example of this, often running on strikingly similar disinformation playbooks. Is that a coincidence? Or are social platforms, their algorithms, and the rumor ecosystem actively producing that political alignment?
Yeah, I think there's multiple things going on. I don't think we can assign all of the singular role to digital media ecosystems. I don't think that would be an accurate description of what's happening. However, we have seen, especially right-wing populist movements, be far more effective at using the dynamics of online media and social media to support their power and their rise to power and their maintaining power. I'm most familiar with the case of Philippines, and through stories from Maria Ressa, who I've met and has told stories, but also through research. Ong and Cabañas did this paper in 2017 about network propaganda or network disinformation, and it's about the Philippines context. And it really talks about the two-way process of influence in these environments. In these online environments, yes, we have this idea that the influencer has power and shapes what their audience thinks, but perhaps more profoundly, that audiences can shape what the influencers think, because the influencers are constantly attentive to their audiences, what they like, what they're saying, what they're adding to the conversation. And so we can see the elites or the influencers themselves be sort of shaped and even captured. And so part of the reason we may be seeing populist movements be so ascendant right now is because of these dynamics not only allow leaders to become more in tune with what their audiences think or want or say, and not just their audiences, but the loudest among their audiences think or want or say, but also become almost more like connected. Like they're literally like kind of wired together and they can kind of spin out of control. And Ong and Cabañas start to get with that idea of like this feedback cycle between audiences and elites is tighter, it's quicker, it's more reactive, it's more responsive. And it seems that some of the loudest and maybe angriest or most outraged voices, but due to the attention dynamics, have the power to shape what our political leaders are doing and saying and who they are as well. But even once they're there, it's this idea that the influencers and elites themselves are being captured by the audiences with these tools. That's what feeds, I think, into the rise of populism, whether that's right or left. It's not clear to me why the right has been more effective at using this, around the world. I don't think that's exclusive. I think there probably are left-wing populist movements that have been able to do this, and we've seen it to a smaller extent. But certainly the rise of right-wing populism is happening at the same time and as what we're seeing. And these dynamics seem to feed populism in a couple of ways. So that's my working theory, but I am open to updating it with more information as we go. And we're unfortunately learning a lot about these sort of dynamics and how they're tied to political configurations this decade, I guess. Hopefully it'll make more sense to us in a couple of years and we'll be able to maybe counter some of the more toxic manifestations of this.
Our conversation is making me think about a paper I read while in law school by Rebecca Hamilton called Governing the Global Public Square, where she critiques the way we often talk about online speech as a triangle between governments, users, and technology companies. Hamilton argues that this framework can be useful, but it often assumes a very American or Eurocentric understanding of speech, power, and harm. And once we think about social media as a global public square, the question becomes much more complicated. A platform moderating content in the United States is not operating in the same context as a platform moderating content in Myanmar, India, Sri Lanka, or South Sudan. The political histories are different. The social hierarchies are different. The languages, caste structures, ethnic tensions, religious dynamics, and relationships between corporations and governments are all different. So when we talk about platform accountability, it cannot just be a question of whether a post stays up or comes down. We have to ask who writes the rules of the public square, who understands the context well enough to enforce them. And when platforms amplify or suppress content, whose safety is protected and whose reality is effectively being erased. That brings me to that larger question of platform accountability. When rumors spread online, what responsibility do platforms bear? Not just as places where people post, but as systems that decide what gets amplified, recommended, rewarded. what would accountability even look like? Who has the power to enforce it?
Yeah, I think that's been the hardest thing is who holds them accountable. It was really hard for us to leave platforms. We're so locked in because, if you were on Facebook 5 years ago, it was really hard to leave because my professional colleagues were there doing our organizing and telling us when the conferences were going to be and the paper deadlines, right? So we become locked into some of these platforms. Emergency responders and others became locked into Twitter, and when it became X, they had a really hard time leaving, right? And so it's hard to vote as our feet as individuals because of the way that these platforms have sort of gathered in so many people, and it's hard to rebuild that community elsewhere. So then it leaves government holding them accountable. Well, that can, depending on how that's done, it can land accusations of censorship when government was trying to pressure platforms to behave differently. And they're still trying to do that. It's just, they're not calling it censorship now because the people who do that are now in power. So we get this sense of if it's a government that is the way you voted, maybe you want them to hold the platforms accountable. But wait a minute, when it's not the government you voted for, do you want them to hold the platforms accountable, right? So we do get this sense of we've seen it happen with other countries that may have authoritarian leadership. Do we really want them selling their platforms? What kinds of content can spread and not? So we do kind of run up into this, how does a democratic society hold accountable these massive platforms that have more users and more power, and in some cases more money than the populaces that are trying to, in theory, hold them accountable? I don't know the solution. And I do think there has to be some relationship to policy, but I'm not sure that that's going to work. And so the other option is mass education and then developing alternatives where people actually could get to other places and be able to replace what they're losing and be able to vote with their feet and move away from platforms that become toxic. But I haven't seen a lot of promise in that either. I do feel a little bit overwhelmed when we're how do we change these logics? And how do we address some of this? But, there are smart people out there that want to make money, and maybe there's an ability to think, okay, is there some other kind of way that these platforms could work that could compete with this attention economy and in the long run could be sustainable financially, whether through donations or whether through another funding model? I don't know what it is, but I think that's an opportunity. And I'm going to hope that there's some creative people out there who maybe can put that into motion.
What worries you the most about the current information ecosystem, particularly with AI making it easier to generate and disseminate convincing false content at scale?
I'm not a really happy guest or a speaker. I don't leave people feeling really uplifted. When I first started studying what I came to understand as disinformation around 2016, 2017, I was reading some authors that were talking about the long-term effects of pervasive disinformation in the post-Soviet states and in Russia. And one of the characteristics is that people just didn't know where they could go for trusted information. They didn't trust anything anymore, right? And because they didn't trust anything anymore, there could be a loss of agency, a loss of ability to think that you can know what's going on. And the theory was that you can't really have a democratic society where people are able to make decisions about self-governance when the people can't think that they know what's going on. And so what worries me the most, and I think AI feeds into this for sure, especially the visual stuff that we have, in a few months, we will no longer be able to figure out whether a video or image is real or not. And for me, the challenge is that we have a whole new relationship that we're going to have to negotiate with content, with visual content especially. We've already gone through it with textual content, but now with visual content, where we really can't know if what we're seeing is real. And what does that mean to live in a world, in a society that we've kind of for a while had certain ways of assigning trust value to textual information and then visual information. And now we're going to have to renegotiate a different way. And that worries me, especially with, the rise of all of these other things, income inequality and billionaires integrated into fascist movements is kind of frightening. And how do you counteract that as a population without being able to find information that you can believe and come to a shared reality and a shared understanding of what problems actually are and begin to work to actual solutions to those problems? So that's what keeps me up nights, I guess, among other things.
So then how can we be more responsible participants in the information ecosystem? And at a societal level, what would healthier collective sensemaking actually look like?
For the last 5 or 6 years, maybe even more now, when people ask me, what can people do to be better in these environments? We had this kind of talking points of slow down, double check. If you're feeling outraged, then you're being manipulated, don't share. And I realized that we were giving people language of just the people that really cared and were trying to do the right thing were being increasingly disincentivized to participate. And I think we began to teach media literacy in a way that really didn't advantage the sharing of quality content, even as like the BS sort of ran the board, right? The people that are sharing, the people that don't care what they share are just, flooding the zone. And so I'm trying to rethink how we give a message about media literacy. And I don't have the answer, but it has to be about, building understandings of how these systems work, what your position is within them, and kind of thinking through what role you want to have, and empowering people to share content that aligns with their values rather than telling everybody to slow down and shut up, right? I don't think that's the right move. And so I really want to encourage like a next generation of information media, digital literacy to really focus on empowering people to share and empowering them to build their own communities and empowering them to find their voices and ensuring that there's some competition in these information spaces between this really toxic sludge of an information space and something else. And there have been people that are doing that, and they've been doing a great job all along. But I feel like we, as a certain group of researchers who are focused on media literacy, may have taken on too much of a negative tone in terms of slowing people down.
Rumors are deeply human. In moments of uncertainty, we reach for answers, for stories that help us make sense of what's happening. That instinct is ancient. What's new is the machinery our sense-making runs through. Platforms built to reward the fastest, loudest, most outrageous version of events, and political actors who have learned to game exactly that. And that is the danger of this moment. Not simply that people will believe the wrong thing, but that we may lose faith in our ability to know anything at all. But here's what I want you to take away from this conversation. The answer is not to go quiet. For years, the advice was slow down, say less, and the people who cared the most actually listened, while those flooding the zone never did. So the work ahead is conscious participation, understanding how these systems work, knowing your position inside them, and choosing deliberately to put things out into the world that align with your values. I want to thank Dr. Kate Starbird for joining me in conversation. Art of Citizenry exists to make space for exactly this: critical thinking, collective imagination, and more intentional participation in public life. If this episode sharpened how you see your feed, share it. Literally, that's the point. Subscribe, leave a review, do all the things. It helps people find these conversations. This podcast is entirely listener supported. Please contribute to it by visiting artofcitizenry.com/support. Thank you to our producer, Ali Honore, and editor, Stephen Blevins. Original theme music by Katrina Zemrak.